Hi, everybody. So tonight I wanted to talk to you about Ishiguro, the issue of cloning, which is one of the big things that's going to come up in the book Never Let Me Go, which we're going to start, and the idea of the other. So here we are moving a little bit precipitously from, the war poets to J. Alfred Prufrock, this idea of sort of fragmentation, this idea of, not having a clear sense of self or a clear sense of identity. And now we're thinking through what that means when we're thinking about a nation, England, that has been such an imperialist power, right? As some of you pointed out in the World War II poems. And that also has a lot of people coming in from, as we would say, off, right, from abroad. And so now we're thinking about what that means in terms of sort of a sense of self. And we can think about this in our own sort of terms as well. I mean, we've had a lot of discussions recently about immigration, about people coming in from the outside, about people who live here but maybe are still marginalized and not accepted. And so I think Ishiguro is really kind of exploring these issues, but in the context of sort of a science fiction novel about, cloning, which is in and of itself interesting. So I wanted to get started with this Prezi. And once you guys watch this, please go, and you've read the first 50 pages of Ishiguro, please go ahead and take the quiz on Oaks, okay? So let me see if I can get this to work. All right, so I'm going to start with Ishiguro and sort of give you a brief biography. He was born in 1954. Obviously, we're in the present day because he is still alive and kicking. Interestingly, he was born in Nagasaki, Japan, and he moved to the UK in 1960 when he was 5 years old. He is one of the most celebrated contemporary fiction authors in the English-speaking world. He won the award in 1989, the Man Booker Prize Award for his novel The Remains of the Day. And I don't know if any of you have read that or seen the movie. That's a beautiful movie starring Anthony Hopkins. And then his 2005 novel Never Let Me Go, which we are reading, was named by novel in with otherness, not entirely Japanese, family went and become more discountingly until a little bit later in donors. And this is to the movie.
8 years old. I now spend most of my time not looking forwards, but looking back and what happened to us at Hailsham.
Catch it, Tommy!
Why didn't Tommy get the ball?
There was once a boy who had ran off beyond the boundary. They found him in the woods, with his hands and feet cut off.
Who told you these stories?
Everybody knows them.
And how do you know they're true?
You make up stories as horrible as that.
Students of Hailsham are special.
Yes, Miss Emily.
Keeping yourselves well, keeping yourselves healthy inside, is of paramount importance.
None of you will do anything except live the life that has already been set out for you. And sometime around your third donation, your short life will be complete. That's what you're created to do.
We were moved from Hailsham at 18. Tommy, Ruth and I.
Exactly how much experience have you guys had with the outside?
Quite a lot.
We haven't.
Drinks?
5 Cokes, please. If there was a boy and a girl, and they were properly in love and they could prove it, then they would be given a few years together before they began their donations.
Why do you do that thing, squeezing Tommy's shoulder? I'm allowed to touch Tommy, aren't I? It's the way you're touching him.
Suppose for a second that there is a special arrangement for Hailsham students if they're in love.
Although Tommy really likes you as a friend, he just doesn't see you that way.
We are modelled on trash.
We're in love. It's true love. It's verifiable.
We didn't have to look into your souls. We had to see if you had souls at all.
I wish I could help you.
You poor creatures.
Maybe none of us really understand what we've lived through, or feel we've had enough time.
Okay, so it's actually a pretty good movie, and it's a pretty faithful representation of the book, although please read the book. And so clearly cloning is a big issue in 2005, and so I wanted to get into that, especially in England, right? It was on May 27, 2005, that an article is published saying that scientists in Newcastle in England have successfully cloned a human embryo, a breakthrough that places Britain at the forefront of the cutting-edge but highly controversial field of embryonic stem cell technology, right? Still a pretty controversial field. Perhaps cloning is not as cutting edge as it was back in 2005, but it's still something that people really debate and think about, right? And then there's sort of the issue of the other, right? So these people are all clones, and they're all also somehow othered, right? So Barry Lewis, who's a literary critic, observes that Ishiguro aligns himself with the post-colonial emphasis, right, on the marginal, the liminal, the excluded. The liminal is sort of the in-between, you know, not one or the other, but something in between, right? And here's another quote about othering by Guo. Ishiguro was born in Japan and brought to England when he was 5, and his ascribed identity as a Japanese-British novelist forced him to linger between a British center and a Japanese margin. So according to Guo, he himself exists in sort of this liminal identity, right? And so I think these two things, the cloning and the idea of liminality, are going to kind of come together in a really interesting way in this book. And that's what I want to talk about. And I think that is related to the idea of the Gothic, which we've been talking about throughout our class. Hopefully you get that. I sort of had a theme. We read Frankenstein, we read Jekyll and Hyde, and now we're reading a third work of science fiction. Interestingly enough, this work is somewhat futuristic, and yet it's set in the past. He said it in 1990, so that's interesting. I don't really know why, but I'd be open to ideas about why that might be, and hopefully we can discuss that in some of our discussions. Sorry to be redundant. So one of the things that Guo and other critics bring up is this idea of the uncanny. Like, why are clones so disturbing to us, right? And in some ways, they're disturbing to us for very similar reasons that Victor creating the creature is disturbing, right? Clone narratives generate the apprehension of humanity that is called into question as reproductive technology, right? Challenges the conventional notion of origin, right? These people don't come from a woman anymore. Moreover, clone narratives usually play on our anxiety over the uncanny, the discomfort we feel when the leitmotif of the double, the copy, the simulacra arouse strangeness, a crisis of one's individuality and identification, a disturbance of subjectivity and objectivity. What if there were someone who not only looked just like you, but was just like you? What would we then, how would we even identify ourselves as individuals, right? So that is Freud's idea of the uncanny. And so I wanted to think about that through some of the passages in the book. Here's one when in the very beginning, pages 5 through 6, when Kathy, by the way, I have the Kindle edition of this book, so I hope my page numbers are correct. Please let me know if they're not. But Kathy is actually looking for Hailsham. You know, she's older, and she always, when she travels, she thinks maybe she sees it. And she says, I might pass the corner of a misty field, or see part of a large house in the distance as I come down the side of a valley, even a particular arrangement of poplar trees up a hillside, and I'll think, maybe that's it, I found it, this actually is Hailsham. Then I see it's impossible, and I go on driving, my thoughts drifting on elsewhere. And that idea of the misty field, the large house at a distance, that idea of sort of obscurity, obviously that, well, not obviously, but that relates to the sublime. It relates to this idea of sort of the Gothic, right? Us not ever being sure what is right in front of our eyes. This is another passage which I'm not going to read. Well, maybe I'll skim it. The idea that there are people who don't hate you or wish you any harm, but who nevertheless shudder at the very thought of you. And this too reminded me a lot of, although I guess the people with the creature do wish him harm, but the idea of Hyde making people feel that he's deformed in some way, but they can't explain why, of how you were brought into this world and why, and you dread the idea of your hand brushing against theirs. A really powerful quote, I think, about people who are seen as other, right? So here's some questions for you guys to think about. Here's some questions for you guys to think about in terms of the book. As you're reading it and you prepare for our quiz, what do you make of the main character, Kathy H? Why is she just Kathy H? Why do you think Ishiguro might write her as a female protagonist? What do you make of Tommy? How is Tommy different? Why is that this novel at a boarding school? And by the way, it's in the 1990s, right, that J.K. Rowling is writing her very famous Harry Potter series. And so clearly, there's some resonance here. Why set it at a boarding school? And why explore the characters at this point in their development? Why have them be looking back to their days at Hailsham? So that's what I've got. And yeah, please do read pages 1 to 50 and then take the quiz online.